Hi, my name is Taylor Love, and I'm a senior at Marymount University, majoring in health science, pre-physical therapy, and I did my honors thesis on onset and degree of sports specialization in relation to injury risk. So my interest in this topic began because, as I said, I'm a pre-physical therapy major, so I've taken a lot of classes in exercise science and sports medicine. I also grew up playing multiple sports, so I've been within the athletic world for most of my life, and I've seen a lot of different levels of competition and a lot of different injuries that went along with that. I've also experienced multiple different injuries myself throughout my athletic career. So I thought that it'd be interesting to see if there's a connection between the amount you're playing, at what age, and if that was leading to more injuries. So a little bit of background on the topic. Youth sports are growing really quickly. More and more kids are starting to play sports at younger ages, and they're doing it at a lot higher intensities than they used to. This is leading to an increase in injury rates of younger kids. So a lot of physical therapy clinics and orthopedic doctors are seeing younger kids with more severe injuries. A lot of this is due to the shift towards club sports now, and that really encourages year-round participation. This is heavily due to a recruiting landscape, but also just due to the fact that kids want to be better at a younger age than they used to in the past. The theoretical framework I used for this study was the deliberate practice theory. So this focuses on a self-reflective feedback loop rather than just repetition. So it's really looking at the connection between the physical activity you're doing itself and how your brain and body is going to react to that so that it can repeat it efficiently as you continue to do it. So to use this, we really needed to understand both the physical and mental demands that it takes. So physically, we need to be aware of the injury risks that go along with this within an athletic person, and then also the mental demands, whereas things like psychological burnout might come into play if a kid's losing interest in what they're doing. So the theory itself really emphasizes practice, but I wanted to acknowledge the limits of its application as well. So this graph on the side shows how the theory works in a musician. So the black line shows how a kid who's going to increase hours is going to reach expertise a lot faster than someone on the white line who's only going to be at an amateur level. And this works well in musicians, but as I'll talk about later, athletics takes a little bit of a different path to get there. So my thesis in general looked at 3 different research questions. The first was, what are the mean scores of degree of sports specialization, age of onset, and total injuries among select female athletes at Marymount University? The second was, what is the influence of age of onset of sports specialization and injury frequency? And the third is, what is the correlation between degree of sports specialization and injury frequency? And then the null hypotheses for the second and third question is that there's no correlation between the 2 variables. So moving into the literature review section of my thesis, I'm going to start off with some important terminology. So sports specialization, it doesn't have an exact definition yet, but a lot of the studies that I read incorporate the ideas of intense year-round training in a single sport at the exclusion of other sports. So going a little further, the degree will be broken down into low, moderate, or high specialization using the Jayanthi 3-point specialization scale, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Onset is going to be the age at which a child specializes in one sport. And then injury frequency, I'm going to have broken down into categories that we'll talk about later too. The first main section of my paper was just talking about injuries in general. So as specialization is increasing, it's also leading to increased injury rates. A lot of the papers talked about injuries broken down into chronic and acute categories. So chronic injuries are things that are going to take a little bit longer to develop. They're going to be from overuse, and they're going to include things like stress fractures and tendonitis, whereas acute injuries are things that are occurring from a single trauma, so like sprains, strains, and fractures. These both will have different recovery times, but it's important to understand the difference here. So the increased injury rates are largely due to movement patterns. So as kids are specializing more and more at younger ages, they're really only moving in one certain way within a sport. So if you play soccer, you're going to kick the ball the same way every time you kick the ball. Basketball, you're going to shoot the ball the same. So if you're only using your muscles in one certain way, they're going to start to break down from that. Whereas if you stress them differently, you might have a lower injury frequency. Another important category was gender differences. So the main thing found here was that females are more likely to specialize than males. The females don't necessarily experience more injuries because of this, but they do experience more overuse injuries. So 63% of the injuries females experienced in this study were chronic injuries, whereas only 42% of injuries were chronic in the males. Another major category in my paper was talking about club sports, which I touched on a little bit earlier. So club sports encourage you to play a single sport year-round. This is heavily due to the shift of recruiting. So this picture on the side shows an AAU basketball tournament. And it just shows you how many games are going on, how many people are there. So these tournaments allow for college coaches to go to a single tournament and see thousands of kids play, whereas if they went to a high school game, they may only see 2 or 3 kids that they're really looking at. So the club sports really brings down the age of specialization, which was my next category. So this talked a lot about the 10,000 hour rule, which states that to become an expert in something, you need to practice it for 10,000 hours. This was originally developed for musicians, but is now being applied to athletics. And because the age at which kids are playing sports now is lowering, they're starting to rack up these hours a lot earlier, which is putting a heavy toll on their body and leading to more injuries. So based off of that, I wanted to go into the recommendations for participation. So they don't have a specific age yet at which they think kids should be specializing, but the only sport that they really have a rationale for to do it early is gymnastics, just because those athletes peak at a much earlier time than any other sport. So based off of that, one study talked to some professional and college baseball players, both of which don't feel that specializing really helped them and wouldn't recommend that others do it. Despite that fact, the study did find that college baseball players were 2.6 times more likely to specialize than professional. And then it went into just all sports in general and found that current high school athletes specialized earlier than both college and professional athletes. So even though the athletes at the top of these sports are saying that specializing didn't really help them, the youth is still going that way. So for recommendations as a whole, they recommend that you don't practice for more than 16 hours a week. Now, this was the standard for a long time, but because kids are playing at much younger ages, they went a little bit further to say that children should not be practicing for more hours per week than their age in years. So if you have an 8-year-old, they should not be practicing for more than 8 hours a week. And then the final recommendation was just that you should not be playing a single sport more than 8 months a year, which goes back to the idea of movement patterns, and that if you're going to be moving in the same way repetitively, your body needs time to recover from that, and you need to be able to strengthen the other muscles and movement patterns to try and counteract some of the stress you've put on your body. This is the 3-point specialization scale that I used for my survey. It was developed by Jayanthi. He originally used the 6 questions at the top to assess athletes' participation levels as well as some social and psychological aspects of their participation. He later narrowed that down to the bottom 3 questions just so he could only focus on participation levels. So the questions I used for my survey were, have you ever quit another sport to focus on one sport? Do you consider your primary sport more important than other sports? And do you train more than 8 months a year in your primary sport? So basically, if you answer yes to any of these questions, you get a score of 1. And then the degree of specialization is at the bottom, which is going to be 1, 2, or 3, low, moderate, or high specialization. Moving into the survey design of how I conducted my research. Moving into methods, I used a convenience sample in my study. I got 42 responses total, 15 of which were women's basketball, 11 women's volleyball, and 16 women's soccer. So basically, I asked them in the survey about their injury rates as a whole, their specialization scale itself, and then the age at which they specialized. And I originally recruited them through their coaches. So I used a Google survey for my study. My inclusion criteria was that you had to be a Division III female athlete at Marymount University. I only sent my survey to basketball, volleyball, and soccer, and they needed to be greater than 18 years of age. For demographics, I only asked their academic year and their sport, and I left my survey running for 4 weeks. So these graphs just show you the breakdown of my participants. So the top graph is broken down by sports, and you can see that I had a pretty even distribution of athletes across the 3 sports. And then the bottom graph shows you by academic year. So the blue is freshman, which is a little bit higher than the rest, but this was expected just due to roster size. This slide shows how I broke down the injuries for my study. So I basically used this same chart 4 times and asked the participants about their injury rates at the elementary school, middle school, high school, and collegiate levels. So I basically broke it down based on how much time you're going to miss from your competitive season. So category 1 was longer recovery acute injuries. So these are going to occur from a single trauma, and you're pretty much going to be shut down immediately following. and before you're even allowed to do anything to try and come back to competition. Category 2 is nagging recurring acute injuries. So again, they're from a single trauma, but you might be able to push through and do a little bit more a little bit sooner. And then category 3 is chronic injuries. So they're going to be your overuse injuries, and you might be able to play through them at first, but you're going to need to rest eventually. So basically, I gave category 1 3 points, category 2 2 points, and category 1 1 point when I added them up to analyze them later on. So moving into the results. To analyze the data in my study, Dr. Alda and I used SPSS version 26. So for research question 1, we used a one-way ANOVA because we had 3 separate variables. And then for questions 2 and 3, we used Pearson correlation coefficients. So for research question 1, we used the ANOVA test, and the only significant variable we found was that basketball players had a higher degree of sports specialization than any of the other athletes. So as you can see, this chart kind of answers our whole question. The average number of injuries throughout all the athletes was 8.52. The age of onset for specialization was 13.29, and the degree of specialization was 2.52. So the average specialization was between moderate and high, which we did expect to see. So for research question 2, we used the Pearson's correlation coefficient. Again, you can see the total statistics up with the descriptive statistics. So we found that there is a direct weak relationship that was not statistically significant. So our R value, which is the correlation coefficient, we wanted that to be closer to 1 to show a stronger correlation, but we only had 0.26. And then our P value, we would have liked to see below 0.05, but it was 0.1. So due to these facts, we accepted the null hypothesis that there's no correlation between degree of sports specialization and injury frequency. So for our third research question, again, we used the Pearson correlation coefficient, and we found that there was an indirect weak relationship between the variables that was not statistically significant. So this means that as when the kids specialized earlier, they had an increased injury rate. Again, our R value was not close to 1, and our P value was much higher than 0.05, so we accepted the null hypothesis that there is no influence of age of onset of sports specialization and injury frequency. So some of the limitations for my study, the recruitment process was done completely online. So originally we wanted to talk to the athletes after one of their practice and read them the narrative and then see if they would participate. But because of COVID, we were unable to do that. So basically I went through the coaches, but at the time of the survey, the volleyball team didn't have a coach, so we used the associate athletic director, who in hindsight may not have had as much communication with them. Another limitation is that we didn't use all female athletes at Marymount. This was primarily due to our timeline. We only used fall athletes because we needed to get the survey done so we could analyze the data in time for our deadlines. Another one is that the system we used to track injuries might not have been completely accurate. If you had more than one injury in one category, that would only be reported once. And then another way the injury rates might be different is that the freshmen hadn't played in a real season yet, so their collegiate injury numbers were probably lower than they might have been if they did compete. And then finally, different sports have different exercise intensities. So if we looked at a wider variety of sports, we might have been able to balance out that variable a little more. So for future research on this topic, I would suggest increasing the sample size. We did see some trends in our data, but none of it was statistically significant, so adding some more participants could help with that. I also would suggest adding in other sports. This could go back to the fact that different sports have different exercise intensities, and then also they're using different movement patterns, so you could look at different injury rates depending on the sport. I also think it would be cool to look at the comparison of male and female sports. So are males specializing more or less than females? Do they have higher or lower injury rates because of that? And then finally, I think it could be interesting to compare Division 1, 2, and 3 athletics. So are Division 1 athletes specializing earlier than Division 3, and is that helping them get to a higher level of competition, or is it not really helping them in the long run? Finally, the significance of my study. So if there are increased injury levels with high specialization, this could validate recommendations to play multiple sports for longer. So this could not only change the number of hours athletes are participating at younger ages, but could also change the club sports world in general. If there's increased levels of injury with early specialization, then club sports really may not have as large of a role as they do right now. So if we moved back to, say, the high school world, like that's going to change recruiting, it's going to change participation levels, it could change a lot of things within the athletic community. And then finally, here are my references. Thank you for listening.